Major support for Carolina Business Review provided by Grant Thornton. Operating in more than 100 countries, our tax, audit, and advisory professionals specialize in helping companies unlock their growth potential. Colonial Life, providing benefits to employees to help them protect their family, their finances, and their futures. High Point University, the premier life skills university, focused on preparing students for the world as it is going to be. And Sunoco, a global manufacturer of consumer and industrial packaging products and provider of packaging services with more than 300 operations in 35 countries.
Bitter, disturbing, poignant, emotional. Those all have been used to describe the latest election cycle here in the U.S., but also most certainly here in the Carolinas. I am Chris William, and thank you again for joining us and supporting the most widely watched source of Carolina business, policy, and public affairs seen across the Carolinas for more than 30 years now. In a moment, we'll start to unpack what this new political reality may mean with four of our expert public policy pundits. And we start right after this.
Gratefully acknowledging support by Martin Marietta, a leading provider of natural resource-based building materials, providing the foundation upon which our communities improve and grow. Blue Cross Blue Shield of South Carolina, an independent licensee of the Blue Cross and Blue Shield Association. Visit us at southcarolinablues.com. The Duke Endowment, a private foundation enriching communities in the Carolinas through higher education, healthcare, rural churches, and children's services. BARINGS, a leading global asset management firm dedicated to meeting the evolving investment and capital needs of its clients. Learn more at barings.com. On this edition of Carolina Business Review, Anna Beavon Gravely from the North Carolina Free Enterprise Foundation, Mary Moore Hamrick of Political Quotient Advisors, Antjuan Seawright from Blueprint Strategy, and Dr. Scott Huffmon of Winthrop University.
Welcome again to this dialogue, and I want to warmly welcome all of you because you are, we don't like to play favorites, but you're among some of our favorite panelists, and we'd like to welcome you to this dialogue as well. Mary Moore, you get the first pitch here. An interesting election cycle, but let's start with one of the things that jumped out during Election Day that was pretty amazing, and that is it's fair to say it was downright record turnout in both North and South Carolina, certainly in the country, of those who not just went to the polls early, but showed up on Election Day. What does that portend?
I think it shows that individuals know how much government is involved in their day-to-day lives, living in a COVID environment, whether you're able to go back to work, are you safe? What's your health care like? I think that people realize that government has much more impact. So I think that people wanted to have some control, so they went to the polls and could vote. It was the one thing that they could do.
Anyone else that washed over? Antjuan, Anna Beavon?
Yeah. So a couple of things. I think for the first time in American history, we had to cast our vote one way or another in the middle of a pandemic that has disproportionately impacted people of color. Mm-hmm. A pandemic has caused some of the worst economic challenges since 1932. A pandemic that has devastated many communities and what the fabric of this country looks like. And so the election was in our face 24/7, all day, every day, in every aspect of our lives. And so it made people who normally would not pay attention, pay attention. People also understood how high the stakes were in this election, and not just what it meant for today or tomorrow, but for future generations. And the fact that in the Carolinas, you had U.S. Senate races on the ballot that would be consequential. You had state legislative races that could determine the future of their states. I think all of those things made a difference. And if you look like me, respectfully, this was a survival vote because the stakes were even higher for communities that look like mine. And that's why you saw the fuel turnout, not just in the Carolinas, but all around this country, in particular when it comes to voting early in this election. There will be a record number of people in both Carolinas who participated early.
Scott, AB?
Yeah, I actually want to go back to something that Mary Moore said. I think that she's absolutely right about people wanting to get out and do something that they could control. And the fact that so many people are really starting to understand where politics and ultimately policy interacts with their daily lives. This is just a perfect example of that. The coronavirus has been front of mind and really just defined 2020 in so many ways, whether you look at the internet and memes or at your friends and their lives and just how you've had to make adjustments every day. And so I think that this is just a encouraging trend toward people being involved and wanting to see where policy impacts their lives and being engaged on that level. But one thing I'm really, really interested to see is what it's going to look like moving forward when it comes to the time of actually making legislation, making laws.
Well, I hate to give the cheap comment, but I'm going to say there's actual truth in everything that's been said. It was really a perfect storm. You know, we have voted under crisis before. I mean, you know, during the Civil War, during wars, things like that. But we've also never had as much access to the ballot as we have now, even though there are attempts to limit access for some. And, you know, there's been examples of that have been undeniable. But still, the ability of people to get to their ballots. Remember, back in the first elections of our republic, you had to travel to the county seat and spend a few days there, usually getting drunk, actually, and then cast your vote, only if you are a property white male. But now, lots of places have early access. You know, we have the mail-in ballot. We're hoping to count them all. It is in the middle of a pandemic that people are deeply concerned about. And the additional thing is all of the information that's out there. So everybody has become passionate because they have access to information that jibes with their personal slant. Because at this point in the United States of America, the enmity between the two sides, the polarization is at you know, very high levels, higher than we've seen since, you know, things like the Civil War.
Well,
but that's affective. Hang on, that's affective polarization, meaning how they feel about each other, not how far apart they really are, but that drove them to the polls, the fear that, quote unquote, the other side is going to get an upper hand.
So let's unpack this a little bit in around the emotion. And Antjuan, I heard it in your voice, and I know this about you to some degree, but the idea that, and these are my words, but each election cycle, Mary Moore, AB, I'd like you to jump in on this as well. Each election cycle seems to get a little bit more poignant, a little bit more bitter. I even heard the term more than once, hateful. That's an unsustainable arc, isn't it? We cannot continue to raise the bar on this emotional back and forth and nuclear option. Don't we have to find a different or a better way through?
Absolutely. I couldn't agree with that more. In North Carolina, as I'm trying to really dissect what's happened over the last couple of days and will continue to happen and in the coming days as we get more absentee votes in, is really just what kind of a vote was this? Was this a vote for decency? Was this a vote to against people who just have really bad behaviors that we don't want to endorse and we don't want to support? Because that's really only how I can justify or make sense of the way that like how Trump is sort of in limbo land in North Carolina, but we have larger Republican control in the General Assembly just because of conversations that have happened in North Carolina and the way those political fights have come down.
You know, my opinions do not reflect my wonderful professor who may be on this event with me today. These are just my personal opinions. The American experiment, the political aspect of the American experiment has always been driven by anger, frustration, and confusion. And where I'm from, sometimes we say the word festivity, although it's not a real word. And I think you've seen a combination of that in elections that have unfolded in my political lifetime. Most would argue that Donald Trump is a response to Barack Obama. Barack Obama was a response to the Bush. Donald Trump was a response to, and Joe Biden will likely be a response to Trump. And so different people show up for different reasons. I think anger, frustration, and confusion still were some of the main reasons people were driven to the ballot box in this election. And keep in mind, and I've learned this to be true over my career, it's so easy for people to vote against something than it is to vote for something. Well, and I think when it's all said and done, you will see that pull through as part of the reason why these elections played out the way they did.
Well, but that gets to, Chris, your question of, is this sustainable or not? We need to get to the point where we're having constructive conversations to develop solutions to real life problems. We can't make compromise a dirty word. We've got to make that our goal, because we have a divided country, and we need to start rolling up our sleeves and having the Congress pass singles. Don't go for Hail Mary passes. Let's just try to govern. Let's learn how to govern and solve the real problems facing America today.
So Scott, go ahead.
But I don't know if we've ever gotten to this place of the thing that we all want. Truth be told, yes, there were people who worked together, but the difference between then and now is we live in a 24-hour news cycle. And social media drives much of the politics and the political conversation in this country. And as a result, the people who are making decisions respond to the constituents they see on social media or they see out and about. And so they respond to the emotions of the voters. And I don't think that's anything different. The only difference is it's front and center now versus before it wasn't as visible.
Dr. Huffmon, is this, and again, this is my term because I heard this term more than once, is this tribal response by the major political parties and factions, is this here to stay, or is this part of the cycle to get us to the next level of democracy or citizenship? And again, I don't want to go down this road too much, but because we have other things to hit.
Just if we believe past is prologue, then it's cyclical. We have been extremely tribal since the first election after George Washington. If you look how vicious the election around Andrew Jackson was, obviously during the Civil War, the corrupt compromise of 1877 that put Rutherford B. Hayes in office, the nasty attacks over socialism for FDR. These things have been cyclical. That doesn't mean that this isn't going to be part of the new normal of the fabric as we go along. But the truth is, everybody has more ammunition to fuel their righteous indignation, as has been pointed out by a couple of folks, because of the 24-hour news cycle. I would say, yes, we're creating a new normal, but the cycle continues to move, and we have seen viciousness in the past.
Barry Moore, I don't want to embarrass you or call you out because we didn't prepare you for this one, but you are an insider in the Beltway. That's fair to say. You spent many years in D.C. You know the Speaker of the House. You know the Leader of the Senate. You know a lot of those people. I mean, you know them. Do you get the sense that the back channeling, not the public comments and the grandstanding that go on in the media, but do you get the sense that the back channeling is the same type of emotional response, or is there some type of better civility that goes on between the parties at that level?
Well, I think that we have a real opportunity if we are looking at a Biden presidency and a Republican-controlled Senate. We have a real opportunity to proceed because a lot of trust has been built up over the years between Vice President Biden, if he becomes president, which it looks like, and working with Mitch McConnell. They were very good dance partners, if you'll remember, when he was vice president, working with McConnell to come up with a package for the budget. So I am hopeful that Biden as an institutionalist and the Republican senators that control Congress will pause for a moment and not start running for 2022 and think about, well, maybe we ought to do something for the American people, and let's find a couple of nonpartisan initiatives to start with, like COVID. It may not be the package that everybody wants. I can see Antjuan disagrees, but I'm an optimist. So I'm like, we have a shot at this. Mm-hmm. And the first thing that I think that we ought to do, if Biden can think about who he names in his cabinet that can actually work with the Senate Republicans, and I would challenge the Senate Republicans to vote for the president's nominees to the cabinet and not have this divisiveness. Let's start with a show of positive support for governing and moving forward, I would challenge a Republican Senate to do that.
Antjuan, were you taking a different tact on that?
1,000%. If there's one thing Democrats have learned, particularly over the past several weeks, that you use the power you have. And Biden cannot afford, for his party's sake, to play the game of Mitch McConnell. What Mitch McConnell said earlier this week was he essentially was going to do what they did to Barack Obama, and that's block any agenda of Vice President Biden. He's starting out the conversation that way because he knows he's going to have power. We will have a slimmer majority in the House of Representatives. So we're going to pass legislation that's going to go to the Senate and die. The Vice President Biden of before cannot afford politically to be the Vice President of before because we're not living in times of before. And truth be told, he will have to deal with, he will have to figure out how to deal with the judiciary. That means try to get appoint people to the lower branches of the courts in a real way, as well as deal with a healthcare crisis that will come as a result of a Trump-leaning court that will dismantle the Affordable Care Act. I don't believe in this. I'm a realist. You may be optimistic, but I'm a realist when it comes to the Washington, D.C. of today.
And let me make a disclaimer here, and I might do this a couple times during this program. That is, this program is being taped and produced right now. Right now means early afternoon on Thursday, November 5th. Things can change pretty rapidly when it comes to outcomes. So if you are watching this program, you might wonder, why aren't you talking about that? Could be because we maybe don't know about it yet. But so Anna Beavon, do you get the sense that if there is a president-elect Biden, that he will have to govern from the center?
Well, I think that's more his style. He seems to be a little more in the middle. He has definitely had a huge leaning of far left advisors throughout this campaign. But I think that might be a little bit more of his, let's get around a table and have a conversation and figure out what we can come up with together. That seems to be his first mode or his default. I'm not saying that he's not going to start flexing some presidential muscle of the party that's in the White House, but I don't think that he wants to start that way.
Well, and I ask you specifically because I cite the election of Roy Cooper in North Carolina 4 years ago, and he was just reelected. And Roy Cooper came out swinging with the General Assembly in North Carolina, which is and still is a Republican. But both sides have seemed to figure out how to work together incrementally. And I'm wondering if that type of arrangement will continue in North Carolina.
I think it's going to be definitely a different story in North Carolina than it will be with the Biden administration, in the sense that there's going to be a lot of pushback from the Republicans. When this election cycle, everybody thought there was going to be a really strong chance of a flipping of power, that the Democrats were going to gain either one chamber or the other. And in fact, that is not at all what happened. Republicans picked up some seats, and they lost one seat in the Senate, still maintaining their power, which means that supermajorities in 2022 are in view. They can go after them. And so I think that the leadership in both the House and the Senate for Republicans are going to hold strong. The big fight in North Carolina has been about Medicaid expansion. I do not see them bending at all on that. That's a priority for the governor, and I don't think that either chamber is going to bend.
Dr. Huffmon, and this is going to seem like I'm poking you in the eye with this, and I'm not. This is a genuine question. Why do we poll anymore, given the last two election cycles have been a little dismal in the results of polling?
Sure. Well, let me start off by talking about what was right. In 2016, the national polls were darn near spot on. In fact, they've rarely been so accurate. And in 2020, the national polls look to have been very correct. The problem is we don't elect a president nationally. So the reason they were off in 4 states systemically in 2016, which gave wrong predictions, is the failure to statistically wait for education. It's not something that had to happen before, because people with college education higher tend to turn out more, but they're also more likely to say, yes, I'm absolutely going to turn out, where people with less than college education are more likely to say, I might or might not. and that's usually fine, except in 2016, across those states, we're talking about Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, folks with less than college education were actually more likely to turn out than usual. So that meant the polls leaned 2 to 3% for Hillary, but the actual turnout looked different. This time, they waited for education, and the polls were wrong in Michigan and were wrong in Wisconsin by a significant amount. Like, you know, it was saying Biden up 8. But others were often within the margin of error and were reported as, in fact, I even heard this election night, the polls had Biden up by 1.5 points within the margin of error. Well, that's not a thing. If it's within the margin of error, it's a literal tie. Now, a broader question, what's the point of polling? And for that, we need to separate the difference between survey research and polling. Polling is simply horse race. It's to guess who's ahead in an election. And frankly, it's not of a whole lot of use to policymakers. Survey research has shown that, look, there's not the non-response bias that we're afraid of in political polling. So, for example, when I do a general population poll, turns out that it looks like all of South Carolina or all of the South. But more recently, in political polling, you've had what some have called the shy Trumpers. It's actually more threatened Trumpers. That, you know, there was a poll that came out of New Hampshire that showed that Trump supporters, 52% of them said, I'm afraid to put up a sign because I think I'll be vandalized, whereas only 15% of Biden said that. So you have to differentiate between what informs policymakers, which is broad survey research, and polling. And the changes in polling are ongoing. Once again, we had several states where they were systemically off, and that needs to be looked at.
Antjuan, when we talk about polling and we think of the Jamie Harrison run against Lindsey Graham, did polling have a role in that? Were you surprised by the outcome, and was polling right or wrong?
Yes, I was surprised. Look, I still suffer from political PTSD because of 2016, when most of us thought that Secretary Clinton was going to be the president of the United States. So after the 2016 race, I got off the roller coaster and decided to just take a different approach to realizing that polls are a snapshot of the time. And depending on who's asking the question, how it's being asked, when, and why, will yield the result you get. And so many of the polls had Jamie's race close because they were measuring likely voters and not necessarily people who are registered voters. What nobody could measure is the Trump effect. And there were so many Trump voters, particularly in rural America and rural South Carolina, who have little to no voter history, who showed up in this election. There were so many people that a poll may never reach because they're not on traditional mediums where posters now have to reach people. And then there were so many people who just flat out lied to posters because they don't want to tell you how they really feel or how they really are going to vote because they feel like that's so sacred and personal. And so that's why you have to take polls for what they are and use them as a measure, but not the final measure. Because there's not a poll in America that did not have Jamie Harrison and Lindsey Graham neck and neck.
Yeah, and let me actually say that Antjuan has those reversed. One of the problems was they were focusing almost entirely on registered voters and doing a really poor job at identifying likely voters, because that's a metric that people try different combinations of things to predict who's actually going to show up. So they're nailing these registered voters, and a lot of the registered voters who are Democrats were saying, hey, I'm passionate about it, but they failed to note, as Antjuan said, that Trump surged, especially at the end. Late-breaking voters made an impact in both Pennsylvania and Florida in 2016, and they overwhelmingly broke for Trump. That happened again, definitely in South Carolina. And when they broke for Trump, they also broke for his attack dog, Lindsey Graham, who was tied at the hip electorally with Trump this time.
There will be a record number of people who voted straight party ticket, both in North Carolina and South Carolina. And that's going to make a hell of a lot of difference in outcomes of these races.
We have about a minute left, and I don't want to short circuit that, but I do want to get this in. Mary Moore, I want to ask you this literally in about a minute, less than a minute. The idea, we talk about the Trump effect. It seems like when we go back to 2016, it was less about Trump and it was more about the anti-status quo. Is that still very real? And when Donald Trump is past president, if he looks like as it will be, is there more about this breaking the status quo than it is about any one candidate?
No, I think candidates matter. I think that you've seen that status quo and the incumbent effect is not necessarily helpful in many cases, and people have this anti-government feeling, because that's why you saw we had President Trump this time as opposed to candidate Trump, and he was the status quo, and it was a personality vote for or against President Trump.
All right, thank you. Go ahead, finish your thought. I'm sorry.
No, I was going to say I completely agree with that. I think that there's something more about liking Trump's personality versus not liking Trump's personality. And I think his personality really was his, is looking like it's his downfall.
Okay. Ann and Beavon, thank you. You get the last word. Well, actually, Scott, are we going to start seeing political messages about Nikki Haley beginning next week?
I'm shocked they're not already on the air. I guess the counting has something to do with that. So short answer, yep.
I'm sorry, Antjuan, I know you want to wade in on that, but we're done. Folks, thank you for watching. Until next week, I'm Chris White.
Major funding for Carolina Business Review provided by High Point University, Martin Marietta, Colonial Life, the Duke Endowment, BARINGS, Grant Thornton, Sunoco, Blue Cross Blue Shield of South Carolina, and by viewers like you. Thank you.